Okay, welcome. I'm joined now by Laura Clews and Chris Hamer, partners at the full-service IP firm Mathys and Squire. They have expertise in patents, trademarks, design protection, and litigation. Welcome back to the show, Laura and Chris.
Thank you for having
Thank you.
us.
Firstly, how would you describe yourself in terms of your dietary status? I know it's a personal question, but has that changed in any way since you've been working in this field?
Well, I think, like everyone over recent years, we've been looking at trying to eat healthier, and especially after COVID and things like that, and being more aware of trying to pick products that are more environmentally friendly. But for me personally, I mean, I'm lactose intolerant, so with particularly reference to the alternative protein fields, for me, any company who produces lactose-free ice cream or cakes or chocolate is definitely good in my book. I think working in this field, everybody's taking an interest in how the technology is changing. But I think working in this field, you get to see more of how the technology works and how it develops. So it's definitely made me particularly curious about the new products that are coming out and more tempted to try these things, to be honest.
And what about you, Chris?
Um, it's certainly an eye-opener about what you consume in your daily diet. I think to me, it's shown that everything in moderation is probably the way forward because there are pros and cons to a lot of things that you eat and are available on the market. And finding the right balance is probably the key, rather than going too far in one direction.
Yeah.
Dairy-free ice cream is the key.
Balance is something I find hard to achieve. Now, given your extensive work with startups and investors in the field, I mean, what technologies are the most promising for you on the horizon?
Well, I think that's a really good question, but quite difficult to answer because the term alternative protein as we use it is a really broad term and can encompass many different products and processes. So things like cell cultured meat, plant-based meat, insect protein, new formation processes, for example, producing whey, these all fall within the alternative protein umbrella. And each one of these sectors has its own challenges, and you can see for each one, companies within these fields have taken very different approaches to tackling these issues. So when you're thinking about manufacturing methods, so for example, forming whey protein, which is obviously with the fitness industry, everybody's trying to be a bit fitter. This has taken off quite a lot. We are seeing an increase in patent filings. For example, companies like Nestle and Perfect Day that are relating to precision fermentation. And I think one of the reasons as to why precision fermentation has taken off the way it has is because it's considered to be a more sustainable process. It's cleaner and it creates more of the product that you're actually hoping to create. But precision fermentation isn't just limited to producing whey proteins. We've seen this in many different areas. So you have egg substitutes, plant-based honey, and using fermentation to produce meat products as well. And in terms of looking at plant-based meat and cell culture meat, a large portion of the research that has been happening currently has been focused on trying to improve the taste and the texture, how these things look, how they cook. Do they cook in the same way as traditional meat products? And in particular, with relation to the cell cultured meat, looking at how to reduce the cost of manufacture. I mean, it has been significantly reduced from, I think it was Mark Post in 2013, who produced the first cell cultured meat burger. And the cost of that burger was about £200,000, maybe a little bit more. So it's certainly come down in cost. But I think consumers in this area would like to see costs come down a little bit further, and you would see a bit more of an uptake. I mean, looking at cell cultured meat and plant-based meat, one of the key areas seems to be trying to improve the texture. So if you have a plant-based meat product, it seems to be really high in protein. And protein naturally is quite globular in nature. So it doesn't have this fibrous texture that you find in traditional meats. And in the same way, cell cultured meat, when you're just producing or increasing the number of cells, if you don't have a scaffold for it to grow against, you also don't create that same kind of fibrous texture.
Mm-hmm.
But the way in which companies are actually trying to tackle this issue are really, really varied. So you have people using 3D printing techniques, edible scaffolds, they're growing cells on blades of grass and using electro spinning techniques. So it's hard to see at this point that you have a particular promising technology that may go forward. There's a lot of different techniques that people are trying to see how it would, how that technology will evolve and what comes out best, basically. And then just quickly looking at insect protein, the research at the moment seems to focus on two areas. So how to dry the insects and how to extract the proteins without reducing the nutritional value or limiting the amount that you're reducing the nutritional value. So if you just heat an insect in an oven, obviously the product you get out of it isn't going to be as the optimum in terms of nutrients. But one of the processes for actually drying insects which caught my eye was using microwave drying used under a vacuum. So that actually seems to produce one of the highest levels of protein compared to all the other drying methods. And then you have all the different technologies and trying to separate out that protein. So you have supercritical carbon dioxide and using ultrasound to separate out the proteins that you actually want. So in a roundabout way, it's very difficult because I think as this is more of a developing field, people are trying many different things, which is quite exciting for us to see.
Yeah.
But it's just waiting to see what has the best effect and what has the best uptake with the consumers at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, are there any potential unforeseen challenges associated with new technologies for producing these new novel foods?
I think there are always challenges. Laura's talked about the consumer uptake. I think it's fascinating when you get into this field to see how slim the margins are between changing from one product to another. Consumers are certainly driven by familiarity, by taste, and by cost. So that is a pretty high burden to cross. And of course, in all of these technologies, as Laura mentioned, it's all very well being able to make the perfect burger for 200,000, but nobody's going to buy it on a regular basis. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on scale up and the ability to actually mass produce these products and to really to maintain the texture, the health benefits, and everything else you need with it. And if they grow and if they develop and it becomes popular across the globe, then you get into logistics of, how do you manufacture? Can you get all the ingredients? Can you supply it? So it's a fairly big ecosystem which still needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe that old proteins, or some people prefer to call them complementary proteins, could lead to a complete shift away from traditional livestock farming, or can, or indeed should, both coexist?
I think certainly for the near future there will be coexistence. The Italian government is already trying to get its food declared UNESCO World Heritage. It's already trying to sort of block out synthetic meats. I know that's happening in the US. I think there's work to be done. I think there's a level of trust that needs to be built. Mm-hmm. There's some interesting research about nutrient bioavailabilibilty to the humans when you eat a natural product versus an engineered plant-based product. And they're not the same yet, and that's not to say you can't get there, but I think you need to take, dare I say it, baby steps, and the balance will probably change along the way, but we're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about IP and what is possible to protect. How is the landscape actually evolving in the sector at the moment?
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was only going to say that over the last couple of years, you've seen increased consumer acceptance and uptake of alternative proteins. And given that there's been, for pretty much every sector that falls within the alternative protein umbrella, there's been predicted an increase in the global market share. And so manufacturers within this area are becoming more aware of the need to protect their intellectual property and how beneficial that could be, because you're having more and more competitors within the same market space looking at trying to get their market share. So I think we've seen a significant increase in the amount of patents which are actually filed. And another thing that we're seeing, so initially you may have seen patents focusing on producing a particular protein or using a particular method to produce a protein or a product. But what we're also seeing now is companies exploring all the extra parts of the area around those processes and the products. So you're seeing more companies looking at, how do I improve a bioreactor to get better cell culture meat? How do I optimize my membrane for separating out my protein more effectively? So I think you're seeing both an increase in the amount of patents that are filed, but also the subject matter to which those patents are being filed is becoming more and more varied.
Mm-hmm. And,
yeah, no, I was going to say I totally agree with Laura on that. It's about, on a crude search, it's about 30,000 patents in sort of protein, alternative protein food since 2005, and it's probably growing or starting to grow exponentially. That shows you that the investment's there, and that the IP landscape continues to develop.
When it comes to the challenges associated with patenting inventions in this field, are there any key ones that our readers should be aware of?
I think that always depends on what you are trying to patent. I think that the way I would look at IP is it is a tool to help you with your business. You have an idea, you have a concept, you want to go to market with it, and IP should be complementary to trying to help you to protect those revenue streams, and to give your business the best chance to develop going forward. Mm-hmm. It can take the form of something which is technical, which would be a patent, and that can cover things from like protein or foods or methods of production or the apparatus, or cell lines, or as Laura's already mentioned, the scaffolds in culture media, or it can also be something more tangible. So the brand that you might want to sell under would be a trademark, or if you have a particular kind of packaging, you're looking at designs and potentially trademarks as well. So there are many sort of different complementary forms of IP that you can use to try and put your business in the best place to commercialize and to go forward. And there's also the possibility of know-how that you'll develop. So many companies underestimate their know-how. They think that because they know, everybody else knows, but it really 9 times out of 10 it's not true, and they can be sloppy with that information. So controlling what you know is important. Knowing what your trade secrets are and what gives you a competitive edge are important. And some of the biggest companies in the world use trade secrets rather than patents, because they want to maintain that competitive edge.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I completely agree with Chris. And I think one of the things that companies find quite challenging is you might have done all the research, you might have created different products, and you get to the end of it and you know your product or your process is brilliant, but you're not entirely sure what you can actually protect. So where you have an alternative protein where the protein is brand new, it might be obvious that you could get protection for that protein. But where companies can get confused is if I have a new process and it's just a different way of protecting a known protein, it's a different method of producing a known protein. Sometimes there's confusion as to whether you can actually get patent protection for that, which mm-hmm. you can. We can look at all the different processes, and as Chris says, it might be the genetically engineered cell lines or the culture media, or actually the process parameters that you're using, which creates an increased yield, or it's more environmentally friendly or cost effective. So sometimes one of the challenges can be just a clear understanding of what you can get patent protection for.
Let's talk about data now. Chris, you mentioned that around about 30,000 patents filed since 2005. It's just one piece of the puzzle, but it can be quite a powerful tool for understanding the overall state of innovation in the sector. So with that in mind, as that number of patents related to alt proteins has been growing over the time, but does that suggest an accelerating pace of innovation?
It shows you that there's a consistent amount of funding going into the research. Based on numbers, yes, it's increasing. I think if you look at the countries involved, so China's first, then the US, then Europe, then Japan, then Korea. Based on size, that's probably not entirely surprising. But I think what you see with patents is those that enter the market first are able to get very broad patents, and they don't necessarily need to file as many. And those that come later, in some ways, are looking to solve the problems that are posed by the early innovators, if you like. And that tends to mean you see a lot of smaller patents, not necessarily the sort of large filing. So if you go back to some of the things Laura's talked about, you might see an early application that would have been directed to an entire burger, and it will say, I can use all of these different fats and I can use all of these different things. Later ones might be saying, actually, the early burgers weren't juicy enough, so we're looking at solving that problem. Or early burgers didn't have marbling, so we're looking to solve the problem of creating marbling. Or even, things like when I cook my burger, it's still pink on the inside, and I don't like it looking pink because it feels like it's raw. Those are things which need to be addressed, and they tend to be in smaller applications. So the increase in numbers is also probably reflective of the fact that people are looking at a lot of smaller issues, not necessarily single big issues.
Mm-hmm. And who are the companies or institutions with the most patents in the field? I mean, does that indicate any potential dominance by a few key players?
I think there are a lot of companies who are in the field of cell culture meat and plant-based meat, but in terms of the larger companies for cell culture meat, it's probably companies like Impossible Foods, Mathys, Tufts College, Just Eat Just. And in terms of plant-based meat, you've got companies like Nestle, Cargill, and Unilever. But I'm not sure whether this actually indicates a dominance within this field, because where you have larger companies, so say Nestle and Unilever, they're quite often looking at a variety of different products. So you might be looking at alternative milks and different ways of making whey protein and plant-based burgers and things like that. Whereas your startup companies are normally focused on one particular product or a range of very similar products. So they may only need to file fewer patent applications. And one of the nice things that I think that you have within this field is you're seeing more and more collaborations between the larger and the smaller companies. So you have Nestle and Perfect Day, I think, are working on new whey protein products. And I think everybody at this point has probably heard of McDonald's and Burger King, their collaboration with Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat to produce vegan burgers. But as we mentioned earlier, the alternative protein sector is so broad, and the way in which people are looking at, or companies are looking at, solving particular issues. So say the texture, or my burger looks too pink and I don't like that, or, what's a way I can produce a higher amount of protein in a particular drink. They all seem to be tackling these problems in very different ways, which is brilliant to see and very interesting, and it's wonderful in terms of creativity. So I think it would be quite difficult for one company to establish dominance in this field, especially at such an early phase. I think people are looking at these problems in very different ways, and it probably comes down to consumer preference in the end.
How much innovation, I mean, Chris mentioned trade secrets earlier, but how much innovation in the field might not be reflected in patent filings?
I personally think when you get into manufacturing, I think there's a lot more than you realize. So even on a crude level, in some technologies, the order in which you mix the ingredients has an effect, or the temperature. And so, patents are a guide. In the old days, you had to it was expected for you to give your best way of operating an invention, and that's not really such a key aspect anymore. And so what you'll see from businesses, and they go for their patent application, is they're putting out there the broad concept as to how to do something, but they're retaining some of the core know-how on those little things that make all the difference. Even from how long you might retain a mixture before using it to come out of a nozzle. I've seen companies using that, and what they find is it changes viscosity, and when you have the change in viscosity and it goes out of the nozzle at a certain temperature, it gives you just that elasticity that you associate with a real meat product. Those are the things I think they're keeping as trade secrets, because when you go to the global market, that is your competitive advantage over everybody else. Nobody wants a mushy burger.
Certainly not. I mean, it's obviously important to protect your invention. So let's have a look at some case studies in the field. Are there any recent patent rulings or cases that could offer guidance to startups in the sector? Might suggest some common pitfalls.
Yeah, there have been a couple of recent decisions which, for companies within this field, I'm determined not to give you food for thought. That's too bad. But things to consider, let's say. And for example, one of the recent cases has been a dispute between Meaty Foods and the Better Meat Company. And this case related to a fermentation process to produce kind of fibrous fungi-based meat alternatives. So I won't go into too much detail because it will be here all day. But essentially, the company Meaty Foods first produced this fermentation process and decided to keep it as a trade secret, which was fine until around 2021. A US patent was published, and it was published by the Better Meat Company, and it named Augustus Patillo, hopefully I'm saying that right, as an inventor. So the issue that came in was Augustus had previously worked for meaty food companies. So they had alleged that the Better Meat Company couldn't possibly have produced this very similar or the same fermentation process in such a short time. And they thought that possibly they had used the trade secrets because Augustus Patillo had been named as an inventor. But when it came to the actual decision, the court held in this case that Meaty Foods hadn't provided enough evidence prior to the hearing to demonstrate that they had produced this process in first, and it had been a trade secret. And I think why I bring this case up is it kind of highlights some of the issues relating to trade secrets and patents. So one of the things that I think it highlights is, given that the predicted market value within alternative proteins and the increasing number of companies which are looking to start working within this sector, I think if you have produced a product or a new process, it's worth really taking the time to consider whether it's more beneficial to keep it as a trade secret or whether it would be better to use patent protection. So you really want to consider how likely it would be that somebody could reverse engineer your process or your product. Mm-hmm. Or if you're confident that they wouldn't, how likely might it be that another company working within that field could produce the same process and file a patent application? So that's one thing to consider. This industry at the moment, if you think back to Mark Post 2013, the cell cultured meat burger, and you compare it to what we have today, the technology has changed massively, and it's changed very rapidly within such a relatively short space of time. So one thing you might want to consider is, say you have developed a product or a process, is that going to be key to your company in 10, 15, 20 years' time? Or are you going to continue to develop that process? Mm-hmm. And if you are going to continue to develop that product or process, is it more beneficial to have a more robust protection in terms of patents for a short amount of time than try to rely on trade secrets? I mean, it may be that, and as Chris mentioned, trade secrets can be very useful in terms of manufacturing processes and things like that. But if you go down that route, I think this case really highlights the fact that you need to think about how you're going about keeping it as a trade secret. So are you making sure that you're limiting the number of people who have access to this information? Are you making sure that if you have to disclose it within the firm, that person knows only the information required to do their job and no more? I mean, are you keeping documents confidential? Have you trained your staff? I think it just really highlights the need to, first of all, consider how you're going to go about protecting your intellectual property, and then how you're going to make sure that you've taken that right path, as in, if you're keeping a trade secret, are you making sure that you've done everything you need to do to follow the correct protocols? Sorry, that was probably longer than intended.
No, it was a great explanation. I mean, it's an industry that seems to be on the outside collaborative, but we appear to be getting more and more cases arising. Obviously, it's a competitive industry as well at the end of the day.
It is, and I think that with the predictions and how the market's going to increase, you're going to see more and more companies enforcing their IP and making sure that they protect their, time and money that they've spent in research and development. So I think you will see more and more litigation proceedings within this field.
Mm-hmm.
And
so go on, Laura.
I was going to say there was another case that I can talk about really quickly, far quicker than the first one. And it related to, I think it's possibly quite well known now, the infringement proceedings between Impossible Foods and Mathys. Mm-hmm. So this related to Impossible Foods had a US patent relating to, it was a meat substitute containing, it was a hemoprotein. Mm-hmm. And how they advertised this hemoprotein, it has the aromas of meat, and it creates that bleeding that you would get from a traditional meat product. So it was quite popular. And they brought infringement proceedings against Mathys. And again, trying to pronounce things I'm not sure of, Hemimi, which is a myoglobin. And because on their website, Mathys has explained that it's a heme protein and it creates the same taste and smell as a burger. They were also producing burgers that contain this myoglobin. I won't try and pronounce the name again. Mm-hmm. But in response to these infringement proceedings, Mathys has launched a request, have challenged the validity of this US patent. So I think this litigation proceedings, it does highlight the fact that you need to really ensure that when you're filing a patent application, and particularly when you're enforcing your patent, that you've really critically assessed your own IP and how secure it is before you start along these proceedings, because it's very common if you bring infringement proceedings, the validity of your patent is going to come into question. So it's more looking, certainly in advance as much as you can, looking at what intellectual property rights third parties have before you start manufacturing your product and process, so you don't fall into litigation proceedings, but also really assessing how secure your IP protection is.
Mm-hmm. And what about if I think my rights have been infringed by another company out there? What should I do?
I think that depends on who you are and what your business plan is. So IP rights are great in that they protect you, but you also have to be realistic about what you can achieve as an entity. So for some companies, that would be an opportunity to seek a joint venture with somebody, be an opportunity to go and talk to them and say, hey, look, I know you're infringing my IP, but I'd really like to work with you. So it can create collaboration. It's a commercial opportunity to potentially sell your IP. And if you're a bigger entity, then you can take other steps and look at the possibility of enforcing your IP or asking the other side to take a license. So it is a tool, as I said earlier, and how you use that tool will depend on your circumstances and what you can and what you hope to achieve.
And the process isn't quick, is it? I mean, I think you referred to the impossible and motive case before. I think the impossible patent was revoked in Europe, and we're still waiting for the decision in the US. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It's not a quick thing, is it?
Different jurisdictions, unfortunately, have their own idiosyncrasies, and so no, it can take many, many years before you end up with a resolution. Which is why, as Laura said, you need to be really certain about what you're doing, because during that time, you're burning money, you have commercial uncertainty for your business, and to be honest, and this is from experience, sometimes ego gets in the way, and a far more pragmatic commercial solution is sitting there, but the parties just can't see it because they've got so entrained in winning and losing. So you do need some good advisors who can sit you down and sort of get you to look at reality.
It's not certainly something you can handle yourself, I would imagine. Now, what are some of the common pitfalls that you see from your work in this field? You're working with startups directly. You're probably working with investors. What are some of those common mistakes that you see that might be good advice for our readers?
So I think Laura covered one of the main ones, which is you really do need to record what you're doing. So recording of information, research, know-how, license agreements, where your research is coming from, contracts, employment contracts, all of those play into IP. And having really good records is one of the things I wish I've had on many instances where the client says this has happened and this is the story, and you try and piece it together and you just can't make it work. Actually, all patent attorneys, for instance, in the UK, they will give you some free time to talk through your IP, where you are, what your business is doing. I think that's really important to take some early advice so that you understand the environment in which you're going to be in and how it will all work for you as a business. Even if there's no business relationship starting at that stage, you will learn a lot as a business about what matters and how to avoid a lot of these pitfalls. Early disclosure is a problem. And again, it's a balancing act. You're a small business, a startup, and you're trying to get funding. So you need to tell people a little bit about what you're doing, but public disclosure will kill your patent in Europe, for instance. And so you're weighing up that balance. And if you understand the balance and what you can and can't do, you can protect yourself from disclosing too much because you don't want to lose it. Other things that sometimes you see are companies try and do too much on the IP front. It's not cheap. It's expensive in the long term, and it just keeps on going. So you need to plan your cash flow versus your IP budget and what you can achieve. And that's a chance for you to keep some things confidential so that you have a later opportunity to protect it when you have more money. And the other thing I think startups also need to think about is what is my business goal? And this can be tough because it's your baby and you want to conquer the world, but at some level you need to work out what you want to achieve, whether you want to do it with third parties, whether you want to joint venture, whether you eventually want to sell your business. And coming to an understanding on those things will actually make the whole IP process, but also the business development process a lot easier. And I think people just don't realize how fast this all comes at you once you start. Business side, IP side, all of it. Because once you're commercial and once you're talking to people, things just seem to keep on going.
And finally, what does the landscape at the moment tell us about the future direction of the sector in terms of innovation?
No idea. I think if you look at 20 years ago, the food and drink industry, I don't think many people would have predicted where we would be today in terms of the technology that's developed and the increase in consumer demand for particular products, the surge in more environmentally friendly meat and healthier options. And looking at how rapidly and all of the changes that have occurred in the industry and the technology within those 20 years has genuinely been astonishing. And one of the amazing things in the alternative protein industry, which we've highlighted a couple of times, is the fact that the way in which different companies actually approach the issues and the challenges that there are within this field is massively varied and quite often completely unexpected, and not the way that you would ever have approached it. So I think if you look, in 10, 15 years' time, it's so hard to say how this technology would have changed and where it would have evolved. I think the only thing realistically we can say in terms of the plant-based foods and the cell-cultured meat is that we know there's a drive within consumers to look at improving the taste and the texture and the colour and the price. But how that is going to be achieved, I don't know. And I think the only thing that you can expect is the unexpected in this industry.
Anything to add there, Chris?
No, I think Laura's right. I think this battle, if you want to call it, will only end when you walk into a grocery store and you can't tell the difference between what's on the left and what's on the right. Because at the end of the day, that's what people want in their choice. And that's what all of these technologies are aiming to do.
Yeah. Well, it's been lovely catching up with you again. We'll have to do this again in 6 months' time or so. Things move quickly in this industry.
Yeah.
So, we shall see. Laura, Chris, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.